David, God's chosen king of Israel. Dear friends, today's video is about a person very familiar to us, a shepherd, singer, king of Israel, and the man after God's own heart, David. In today's story, we will see how David, who was born in Bethlehem in Judah and lived as a shepherd, reached this height. When we hear Bethlehem in Judah, the first thing that comes to our mind is that the birth of Jesus happened there too, right? David's birth occurred approximately more than 1,000 years before Jesus was born. David was born as the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, a Bethlehemite. Apart from these 8 sons, Jesse had 2 daughters as well. It may be because he was the youngest, David was not given the respect he deserved. Time passed and David grew up. Like any other Israelite, David too started out as a shepherd. He was faithful in his job. He was capable of taking care of the flock under him. David took care of his flock like how God, his shepherd, took care of him. By this time, it had been almost 350 years since Israel had possessed their promised land and formed a nation under the leadership of Joshua. During this period, many of them had mingled with the Gentiles that they hadn't driven out, and lived in the nations surrounding them. While they had the Lord as their king, they wanted a king from among themselves like the nations around them. Though that was outside the perfect will of God, He granted their request. God gave them Saul, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin, as king. Saul, who initially felt that he was not worthy to be the king of God's chosen nation, Israel, later, in the pride of the throne, began disobeying God. Though God sent Samuel to make Saul realize his sin and repent and come back to God, instead of repenting, Saul justified himself. At the beginning of creation in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve made the same mistakes, right? Disobedience, and when asked about it, justification. In both cases, God's decision was the same. He sent Adam and Eve out of Eden, and likewise decided to send Saul out of kingship. Within 2 years since Saul started his reign, God in his heart removed him from kingship. Yet God let him sit on the throne a little longer. However, God continued with his plans. God called Samuel and commanded him to anoint as king one of the sons of Jesse the Bethlehemite. Samuel feared that Saul would kill him if he finds out about this. Though Samuel had anointed Saul as well, Saul did not give that respect to Samuel. However, Samuel decided to obey God and filled his horn with oil. He went to the city and prepared for the sacrifice, and invited Jesse and his sons. Then Jesse went there with his sons. When Samuel saw the oldest son Eliab, he thought that he was the Lord's anointed. But what Samuel saw on the outside was not what God saw in the inside. So God did not choose him. Then the second and the third, all the way down to the 7th, came before Samuel. But God had not chosen any of them. Yet Jesse did not mention that he had one more son. But when Samuel asked, "Are all your sons here?" he sent men to call David. David had gone to keep his sheep. Thus they brought David. He was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. Then the Lord told Samuel that he was the chosen one, and to anoint him. Then Samuel anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And David went back to his sheep. Just as he was handsome, his heart was also clean. He would play the lyre very well and was also a good singer. David, who had received the anointing to become king, did not try to overthrow Saul and become the king. He believed that God would fulfill the promise he made in his right time. He continued his current work of shepherding his flock faithfully. By now the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, who had made disobedience a habit. A tormenting spirit from the Lord afflicted him. Seeing Saul afflicted was painful to his servants, so they tried to find a solution. It may be because they felt that music could comfort the human mind, they decided to try that path. They found David for that. In the eyes of those soldiers, he was not only handsome and a musician, but also a warrior, a man of valor, and prudent in speech. Moreover, they understood that the Lord was with him. Thus, on Saul's request, Jesse sent David to Saul. On seeing David, Saul liked him very much. Then David became Saul's armor-bearer and stayed with the king. And whenever the harmful spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. Though David stayed with Saul, he went back and forth from the king to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. The 3 oldest brothers of David were in Saul's army. At such a time when David was at home, the Philistines prepared to attack Israel. Instead of directly attacking Israel, they placed a giant called Goliath in front of them and challenged Israel. If any Israelite fought with him and killed him, the Philistines would become servants of Israel. But if it happened the other way around, Israel was to become their servants. But none of the Israelites had the courage to fight Goliath, who was 9 feet and 9 inches tall and of a hefty build. Saul, who was a head taller than everyone in Israel, was present in the camp, yet he did not have the courage to face Goliath. Goliath, however, came forward and took his stand morning and evening for 40 days. On the 40th day, David went to the camp to check on his brothers along with the supplies his father had given him. He too heard Goliath's challenge. David couldn't stand and listen to Goliath defying the armies of the Lord. He decided to fight Goliath. When a young boy decided to fight such a huge giant, everyone tried to stop him. But in the belief that God was with him, David stood firm in his decision. Seeing his determination, Saul allowed him to do that. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. But David, who was a shepherd, was neither used to wearing armor, nor did Saul's armor fit the young boy. So David decided to remove the armor and go as he was. He took his staff, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch, and had his sling in his hand, and approached the Philistine. On seeing David come towards him as if he was a dog, Goliath mocked him. Then he drew near to meet David. But before Goliath could do anything, David took out a stone and slung it, and it struck Goliath on the forehead, and he fell to the ground. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took Goliath's own sword and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled, and Israel won the battle. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Saul's son Jonathan loved David as himself. But when Saul and David returned from battle, the women who came out to meet them gave David more credit for the victory. Saul understood that the hearts of the people had now turned towards David, and Saul eyed David from that day on. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. He decided to move David away from him and made him a commander of 1,000. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them, and the Lord was with him. Saul, on seeing David's growth, decided to eliminate David. The first step to that was planning to give his elder daughter in marriage to David. In return for his daughter's hand, all David had to do was fight the Lord's battles. The intent behind that was to let David die at the hands of his enemies. But David turned down the offer, saying that he was not worthy to be the king's son-in-law. While he was sad that his plan did not work, Saul got news that his younger daughter Michal liked David. This time Saul approached David with the help of his servants. This time too his intention was the same. Now David agreed and they got married. But Saul's plans did not succeed. Saul began to fear David more. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Saul commanded his son Jonathan and his servants to kill David at any cost. But because Jonathan liked David very much, he did not agree to that. So Saul decided to kill David himself. Then, with Michal's help, David escaped from there. He went to Samuel in Ramah and informed him of things. The next few years of David's life were a race to escape from Saul. And with David in this race were his brethren, his father's house, and besides them the distressed, the debtors, and the unhappy. They understood that the Lord was with David, and that they had safety there. David and his companions traveled through many places to escape Saul. Meanwhile, David had the opportunity to kill Saul twice, but he did not do that. He stood firm in the decision that he would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As Saul was pursuing David throughout Israel, David decided to leave the country. So he went to the Philistine land of Gath. When Saul came to know of this, he stopped pursuing David. David, who reached Gath, requested the king of that place, Achish, to give him some land. So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant." In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. Achish took David along. By this time Samuel had died. Saul was terrified when he heard that the Philistines were preparing for war. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul went to a spiritist to inquire about the same. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek. But seeing David with Achish, the princes of the Philistines suspected David, and refused to take him with them. Then David and his men went back to Ziklag, as instructed by Achish. When they returned, a tragic news awaited them. In the absence of David and his men, the Amalekites had overcome Ziklag and burnt it, and taken captive the women and all who were in it. Then David and the people who went with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Then, as per the instruction of the Lord, David and his men pursued the Amalekites and defeated them. And David restored everything that was taken captive. Moreover, David also captured all the herds and flocks of the Amalekites. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoils to his friends and elders of Judah and in Hebron and for all the places where David and his men had roamed. Meanwhile, Saul and his sons were killed in the battle against the Philistines. On hearing of their death, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead took the bodies and burnt them. Then they took their bones and buried them. After this, David inquired of the Lord about going to one of the cities of Judah, and God agreed. And by the command of the Lord, David went to Hebron with his family and the people along with him. Then the men of Judah came and anointed David as king over the house of Judah. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, had begun reign over the rest of Israel. Saul's commander Abner continued as Ishbosheth's commander. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. In one such battle between them, David's nephew and Commander Joab's brother was killed at the hands of Abner. Years passed by. It had been almost 7 years since David became king in Hebron. At that time there was a disagreement with Saul's son Ishbosheth and his commander Abner. After that, Abner made a pact with David to bring all Israel to David. David also asked for his wife Michal back. They agreed. At Hebron, David had 6 children from 6 wives. Joab did not like David making a pact with Abner, who killed his brother. He secretly called back Abner, who had gone back after making the pact with David, and killed him. When Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Then one day 2 of Ishbosheth's soldiers killed him on his bed. And the people of Israel, who lost both their king and commander, came to David and requested him to be their king. And the elders of Israel anointed David as king over Israel. David was 30 years old at that time. Because the Lord God of hosts was with David, he was successful in everything he did. God handed over all his enemies into his hands. At that time, Hiram, king of Tyre, made David a palace of cedar. David, who understood that God had established his kingdom, decided to bring back the ark of God from the house of Abinadab on the top of the hill. But because they did not try to take it according to the rules, that attempt failed. Then they set the ark at the house of Obed-Edom and went back. 3 months later, they decided to bring back the ark according to the law, and they brought it back to Jerusalem and kept it in a place prepared for it. Because the ark of the Lord was in a tent, while he dwelt in a palace of cedar, David expressed his desire to build a temple for God. But God did not let David do it, but said that his son will do it. Yet David prepared a lot for it in his lifetime. Then, in the spring, when kings go to war, David sent Joab and his army to fight against the Ammonites, while he stayed in Jerusalem. One day in the late afternoon, when David was walking on the roof of the king's house, he saw a very beautiful woman bathing. He summoned her and lay with her. She was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of the soldiers of David. Then, to make Bathsheba, who was pregnant, he had Uriah killed. This displeased God. As punishment for David's sin, the child born to them died. Not only that, the sword did not depart from David's house. David's firstborn Amnon defiled his sister. As revenge for that, another son of David, Absalom, killed Amnon. As years passed, Absalom plotted against the king. When David heard of this, he fled from Absalom. In the battle that followed, Absalom died at the hands of Joab. David came back to the throne. Then, one day, David decided to count the fighting men of Israel and Judah. Though Joab opposed at first, he had to follow the royal order. But this too displeased God. All Israel had to pay for David's sin. They had to face 3 days of plague. David acknowledged his mistake and repented and prayed. On the command of God, David bought the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite and raised an altar there. Then the plague left Israel. When David's life was about to end, he made his and Bathsheba's son Solomon king. Then David called Solomon and provided him with the plan of the temple that he wanted to build. This plan was given to David by God. Though David was a king that God chose, he too made mistakes. But as soon as he realized that what he did was wrong, he did not hesitate to run to God with a repentant heart. David never repeated his sin. These things made David a man after God's own heart. This is why it pleased God to establish David's kingdom forever, and to send his son Jesus to be born in the line of David. Then David, who reigned over Israel for 40 years, died at a good old age, full of years, riches, and honor. He was buried in the city of David. Here, the story of David, the son of Jesse, the man after God's own heart, and the sweet psalmist of Israel, ends. God bless you.